All right.
Yeah, so I firmly believe that that engagement-based algorithms for social media are dangerous to our society. Would be my belief.
Okay. Um, what's your what? Why is this belief important to you, or what kind of goal do you have around this belief? What way do you think the world should be different with regard to social media algorithms?
I think that we need to change it from the engagement basis, because I think that it's actively causing harm both internally to people psychologically, and the way that they do things based off of that, where they go and like march on a capital.
Mm-hmm. So let's identify a little bit about your claim here. Do you think that we should have social media that works off of a different system that's not an engagement-based algorithm? Or do you think that we should not have what we refer to these days as social media?
I think we can still have social media, because I think social media has always existed in some form or another, even if it was just basically meeting at a coffee house, and that coffee house was your MySpace top 8. I'm dating myself, but
I remember MySpace.
Yeah, no, remember? So long ago, back when we thought it was all fun.
Oh yeah.
But the way that it's used to just focus on only engagement right now is what I think is the dangerous part.
Okay, so your claim is that we should not have engagement-based algorithms powering social media.
Yes.
And what's your confidence level on that claim from like a 1 to 7? With 7 being the highest.
So I would say 6.
Okay. What's an example of a fact that might change your opinion about this if that fact were to be true?
So I think what would change my mind is if it was for sure if we had a worse version that was going to be implemented. So it's possible there's worse versions and that this is a better version than what we could have.
Okay.
So if there was a worse version, that would definitely change it. If we had some sort of test where there was a different system that was not engagement based, that we could show didn't do as many bad things or did more bad things, that would also change it.
Okay. One question that I have for you is, can you clarify what the substantial difference is between the types of algorithms that power our social media today and simply the things that would happen in the real world if we did not have those sorts of algorithms? Because, for example, there have been military coups and genocides and all kinds of terrible things in the world before social media algorithms. Certainly today, some of them are aided and abetted by social media and in part by the algorithm. But what makes you believe that the world would be better without these algorithms? Might people not just put their energy into a different thing that's equally negative?
So I think the difference is it's just adding fuel to a fire. It's not necessarily always the specific match, but it expands out how quickly those changes can occur. It used to be, if you had the good old Pony Express, you're going to run a lot of horses dead to reach 50 million people in one day with something, whereas this social media algorithms that are just like, oh, people are angry reacting to this, and then it expands it out to people who wouldn't have even seen it. Now all of a sudden you have 50 million in the course of a couple hours.
Right.
So it makes it exponentially worse.
Yeah.
For anything bad that's already happening.
That makes sense. Would you say that the January 6th attacks on the U.S. Capitol is a good example of this working?
Yeah, January 6th is a great example. There have been some other country revolutions that have occurred, or government has suppressed things with algorithms or pushed false beliefs.
Right. So this isn't necessarily my belief, but are you open to the idea that maybe without these algorithms, would have the same events, just either smaller, a combination of smaller, more dispersed, and they would be less a part of the national and international political dialogue in such a way that the same insidious forces could wreak havoc on the world, but there would be too many different small variations of them all over the place to have the types of focused discussions that are possible today if you sit down with someone on a respectful basis.
So I think you would still have small pockets, and that's small pockets are a little easier to deal with versus 100,000 people. So my personal experience, I've been in a lot of small pocket things that can get shut down real quickly.
Right.
And that's because the police are like, oh, we've got the numbers.
Right.
So we're going to rush it. Whereas versus January 6th, a lot of people commented about how like, oh, if this was a different sort of protest, it would have been handled differently. They also had larger numbers. So I think if you had 5 people showing up at the Capitol, it wouldn't have been as much of an issue. Or even 4 groups of 5. Maybe they all carpool in their own little SUVs and pull up and they're like, we're going to take it over. And they'd be like, F off, versus what happened. So I think removing that exponential factor also makes it more controllable. It's like when we look at diseases and it's like, hey, when COVID or monkeypox or whatever, it was like 1 or 2 cases, we're like, hey, this is bad, but it's not a pandemic. And then you hit this exponential level where you're like, oh crap.
Right, whether that be population density or going to concerts or whatever, like
or tweeting, or social media algorithms.
So I guess, and anyone feel free to jump in here a little bit. I think I agree with you on your claim, but I'm curious what your, and forgive me if this is the wrong direction here, I'm curious what your alternative would be, because the thing that's always so difficult for me when I think about the problems of social media today are that it's almost a necessary conclusion or a necessary step in history from back in the day when each town would have its town TV channel, and you'd have local media and you'd have your local paper, and basically people would for the most part agree on the facts. But now you just have crazies all over social media saying crazy stuff, and it's the most extreme. And I'm curious, and of course, one of the big reasons here behind these algorithms, I'm curious, do you agree that the reason these algorithms are so powerful today is because they make it profitable for the companies that run these social media giants like Facebook?
Yeah, I think that because that whole thing of if you're not the customer, you're the product.
Right.
The purely engagement based, where it's going to keep people there no matter what, is where the problem is. So you can have engagement in there. There's some different things that have been pitched, and some different news sites. Like before you can comment on something, you have to prove you actually read the article with like a couple of questions. And there's some people who've looked into, we can analyze positive words in statements with AI. Like we have all this AI that we're using to not always to do good, and just instead to drive engagement. Like having the AI analyze and see if it's just a negative, quick one-off that's an engagement piece, and then rank it off of that, or if it's actually a positive, stimulating conversation. And then maybe the engagement would be not just engagement, it would be productive conversation that would be rewarded, instead of just inciting some emotional response quickly.
So I had a question kind of going back to the root of like what would make you change your claim. If it came out that this engagement base of social media has done more good than it has bad. So we also have examples of corrupt governments being overthrown by the people. As an example, counter January 6th. If there was a study that came out that showed more good has been done for more people overall, for health, wellness, etc., would that change your mind on it?
Yeah, if it was overall. because it is definitely a less of two evils
Right.
situation. You're always going to have people interacting and being dickheads. That's proven just by my family reunions. So if it was overall less bad versus what I would think would be a more ideal version, where the algorithm is rewarding positive, constructive engagement versus just any engagement. And I think that's probably an important definition and difference, is any engagement versus constructive engagement.
I'm curious where you think the responsibility to change the status quo lies. Do you think that the government needs to regulate the space, or do you think that social media users are weak and need to dump Facebook or dump Instagram or simply get off of these platforms and go found other ones? Or what is the thing that needs to change? Because certainly there's an aspect of the current modern day social media phenomenon that's kind of like Netflix. We didn't used to binge a show over a weekend. We used to watch one and go, okay, that was fun. Now I'm going to call up my friend and go do something. And now a show will come out and all 12 episodes drop at the same time, and we go, I'm going to binge this. So I guess what I'm getting at is even if we agree on the problem, where do you think the responsibility lies for change?
So I would compare it to like companies when they're polluting the environment. So companies should self-regulate for sure. If they don't step in at a point that's causing people harm, that's where you have the government is designed to protect people. So I would say it's 3 parts. So ideally, very, very first part, and this is the hardest part to do, would be people themselves also don't encourage the bad behavior and don't engage in it.
Right.
That's kind of the hardest
Show
one.
some restraint.
Yeah, because you can have 90% of people showing restraint and 10% don't show restraint.
Right.
And you still end up with 4chan. And
just out of curiosity, is that a rough estimate of what you think the landscape looks like? Do you think about 90% of social media users are using it appropriately and 10% are bad actors?
I think it depends on whether or not you have anonymity on the platform.
Oh, okay.
So that's a whole different.
Okay,
depends
sure.
on the platform. But so user would be one piece. The final intervention step would be government, and I think we've hit that point where.
Okay, that was my next question.
Yeah.
Do you think that the platforms have appropriately self-regulated right now?
Based off of the internal documents leaked and them knowing that there were issues that they didn't address, I would say that we are trusting a sociopathic toddler with a knife. So I would say crossing that line now is where I would say government intervention would be necessary, because they haven't self-regulated and some people just be dumb.
Do you think that there's an appropriate way for the government to regulate social media that is not infringing on the freedoms of the social media companies in a way that is problematic, either in the context of this country or just morally? Because certainly if the government told a newspaper what they could or couldn't publish, would find that extremely troubling. And I think that you and I would probably agree that there's a difference between that and social media, but it could be hard to nail down exactly what that difference is.
Yeah, and that you definitely get in the weeds there, but I think we have actually seen that exact occurrence happen. So I'm a stand-up comedian, and George Carlin famously has the 7 words you can't say on television.
Oh, yeah.
So we've already had the government come in and say, hey, listen, you can't say XYZ on these certain large broadcast platforms. You can't shout fire in a crowded theater, and there's debates on that, but most people aren't really upset that you can't say the F word at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday in the middle of Oprah. Or if you do, you have to bleep it. So we've already seen some intervention happen, and there's this whole debate between platform or publisher. So if Facebook is just a platform, then it's just people using it like a public forum, but there are responsibilities on publishers to not deliberately do bad things. If a newspaper is deliberately continually publishing things that are problematic, false, and inflammatory, then things can be stepped in.
Right.
From perspective. So I look at it more from especially with, once again, going back to the AI thing, where they say we have all this smart AI and we can identify XYZ. And that's what they tell their shareholders at their share meetings. So I'm using their definitions of what they can do for moderation and regulation. On all the positive aspects, the fact that they're not using it, and that they do have the knowledge, to me, is where that shift from platform to publisher goes over, is because they are making moderation. If someone puts, a beheading video on there, Facebook will remove it.
Right.
That doesn't violate First Amendment, but they've made a
Who do you
choice.
think should be in charge of regulating the social media companies to change their algorithms to be a way that would be more agreeable to you? And how as a society agree on that regulatory body?
Clearly Tom from MySpace. He's all of our friends. He has the expertise. No, and that's where you get into the law weeds. And that's where I'd say, looking at the first step, algorithms that focus only on engagement, including negative, angry reactions. There's this great poet that once said, "Fear leads to hate, hate leads to anger, anger leads to the dark side." And that anger is where it goes into the dangerous parts. So sitting down with an expert like a psychologist and saying, here's the things we can identify where, it's going to cause eating disorders if all we do is take this teen who's having body image issues and then shove attractive girls in front of her all day to compare herself to, and then we target ads knowingly off of XYZ.
Right.
Like, that's that extra step of using that data, that big data that they say they have that makes them so good according to their own definitions of, what someone's thinking. Yeah. And then they're using that in a way that we can establish would cause harm internally or would invoke them to harm people externally.
Out of curiosity, do you feel that social media companies are running the algorithms they have in the way they are right now out of malice, or do you feel that they're doing it basically because it's taking the easy route to growth and profitability?
Yeah, money. It's off of money.
And would you agree that the reason that they use the sorts of algorithms they do are because they can hire some engineers and it can basically be a set it and forget it algorithm that they just adjust as they go a little bit, and that the amount of effort they have to put in and the money they have to put in to keep the algorithm alive is low?
I would say that they don't want to put the money in to creating an algorithm that would create as much profitability, because they found like the easy button. Right. And there's a much more difficult button, and they want to go with the easy button because the hard button might like cost them 10 times as much.
Yeah. Do you think it's possible for the social media companies to have an algorithm we can say a social media company to make it simple? Let's just say we're talking about Facebook. Do you think it's possible for Facebook to come up with an algorithm that nets Facebook as much money while not being such a negative force in the world, or maybe even being good?
That is a good question. That relies on, once again, the people at the bottom. So that's one where I don't know, because it relies on people also being driven by good instead of anger. I would like to think the best of people. My personal experience says they've found the most profitable method.
Yeah. So I feel like I'm agreeing with him on his claim overall. Would anybody like to take over for a bit? Who wants to? Cool. That sounds fun. Yeah. Sure. I guess to conclude the conversation here, I feel like is it a fair statement that from our conversation, you and I most likely agree on the problem, but would maybe not necessarily agree on what the solutions are, or at least we agree that there's a big problem here with the social media algorithms, but that proper regulation of them is going to be extremely challenging.
Yeah, definitely that it's a difficult task to fix, and we might not even know what the right answer is yet.